Hey, tonight I'll be discussing Hart's essays in philosophy and jurisprudence. And I think the first part, I'll try to say in my own words what I think he's doing with the essays. And then in the latter part, I will read out the second essay, which is what I'm covering right now. So I think he's trying to do about three things. First, he's defending legal positivism and both traditional legal positivism, so J.L. Austin and others. And he's trying to build on that. Specifically for Austin, he's going against command theory, which is the idea that law is a command backed by the threat of punishment, and he builds on that to establish both primary rules, secondary rules, as well as the rule of recognition. And so he builds on that basically and says it's more complex, using a method that he thinks better elucidates the meaning of law against mere definition. And he's building on a legacy of several other philosophers, both jurisprudential and others, in their method. So mostly inspired by J.L. Austin and Wittgenstein. Bentham I should start with, because he thinks he's a really brilliant guy. So yeah, I think so. Yeah, so that's the first thing. He's defending legal positivism. He's also critiquing natural law, because he doesn't think there to be a necessary connection between law and morality. He does think morality to influence the law or the making of the law, but he still believes there to be an inherent difference in kind between the two. And so he doesn't believe those there to be such substantial overlap as for us to say the two are intertwined or inextricably linked somehow. And thirdly, he engages with the ideas of his contemporaries. So he discusses, and he goes beyond just jurisprudence. So he talks about political philosophy. He discusses roles, ideas, and he agrees with him largely. And I think one pushback he has is against his notion that liberty is the highest value in society, and he questions what happens when it competes with other values that may be just as important. He otherwise agrees with him largely. I haven't yet read that chapter, but from skimming that's the sense I get. And then I think he also engages with several other systems. So he engages so first he engages with people from the UK as well, so other legal philosophers. He talks about American jurisprudence and ideas from there. He discusses Scandinavian jurisprudence. So he engages with a wide array of thinkers, both within jurisprudence and outside, and with such clarity. And I didn't mention these essays, 17 essays written over 28 years. Oh my goodness. How fortunate are we to have that record and to be able to just revisit this, and written with such clarity. So yeah, that's basically what he's doing. That's roughly what I'd say he's trying to attain through these essays. And much of this does inform several other books he writes. I think he has an essay on the connection between, I may not recall now what it's called, but I believe it's what, so first, in his first essay where he's defending legal positivism, that turns into the concept of law, which I have somewhere. And then he has a chapter on the connection between law and obligation and responsibility. That turns into what later became law, morality, and law, liberty, and morality. And then he has another section on retribution, so basically punishment, and that turned into punishment and responsibility. So many of his books come from this, but written over 28 years. Can you imagine? And it shows. It really shows. So I think I'll start with the first essay, which I've read and truly enjoyed. And here he's discussing his approach to legal theory and the method he's trying to use. Oh my goodness, it just opened my eyes, and I'm so grateful. But yeah, he's excuse me, he's expanding in a radical way what people had believed the law to be. And the last thing I read before I came on here, maybe about 2 hours ago, was he discusses how much of what he's writing wasn't just, because many people think of ideas or people theorizing as, just people believing in the abstract. And some people say to people trying to philosophize that they should go out and do something. But this is doing something, because much of what they thought has informed practice. It's informed how lawyers think, how judges rule, legal systems, how we think of legal systems, how we think of constitutions, directly deriving from his idea of the rule of recognition, how we think of primary rules which dictate conduct, as opposed to secondary rules which help organize the system or tell us how the primary rules will function, and the rule of recognition. These things inform practice, so it's not a waste of time. But beyond that, it's brilliant because he's trying to think of things that really concern us. Because think of it, the command theory posits that a law is an idea, so it is a command backed by the threat of punishment. It sounds logical, and it's conceivable to me how this idea could be held for so long, because previously, before this method, on which I'll comment later, some more was expounded. It makes sense trying to describe the word law, to describe it as such, but turns out it's limited. It comes in and says, wait, what about laws that tell us who makes the laws, or laws that tell us how those laws should function? How about laws that don't involve commands? How about laws that state obligations, or laws that empower people to act a certain way? And then he also goes into all sorts of questions regarding how terms were described within that theory. So it's brilliant. And I think I'll end there with this, because I may stay on about 1 hour, just because I want to read parts of the second chapter. I hate rushing reading these essays, because 28 years he put into this, and obviously he wasn't writing justice for 28 years, but I just have utmost reverence for this work somehow. And I feel I'll try to read slow, so I want to rush and get into the essays. Actually, pull this up here. But I'll read the sections I highlighted, some of the sections I highlighted, so that I can, well, I think I'll do that first before opening this. So some of the sections I highlighted that I thought were quite insightful. So first, here he's talking about his hope for the work. And yeah, I'll just read it. So he says, quote, this is in the introduction: I hope that my use of philosophy in this last essay supports the belief on which I have acted in most of my work, that if there is some philosophical point that if there's some philosophical point which can clarify or settle issues which non-philosophers have found problematic, it is always possible simultaneously to expound for them the philosophical point and to use it for that purpose. I won't try to even add to what he says. Okay, and this is also brilliant. He was talking about the legacy on which he builds in his ideas, and he says, well, he's talking about J.L. Austin and Wittgenstein. Well, I think I'll start from up here. I'll start. Okay. Nonetheless, both were inspired. So that's J.L. Austin and Wittgenstein. Both were inspired by the recognition of the variety of types of human discourse and meaningful communication. And with this recognition, there went a conviction that long-standing philosophical perplexities could often be resolved not by the deployment of some general theory, but by sensitive, piecemeal discrimination and characterization of the different ways, some reflecting different forms of life, in which human language is used. He's basically referring to Wittgenstein's idea, Austin's idea here in using language, understanding language within its context to make meaning of things. It sounds so basic, but it's so profound in understanding not just even jurisprudence, but several other, not just that branch of philosophy, but several others as well. Okay, so I think I'll skip this one. It's too specific. And then let's go on. I'm so eager to jump to where he basically elucidates how he'd, using this method, describe what the question, what is a right? Oh my, it's just excellent. I think I'll jump to that and then start reading, because I was actually just on the introduction. I didn't even start the first essay. That's how fun it is. And his footnotes are really elaborate as well. So he just points you to where he's getting everything. It's quite fun. Okay, so yeah, just if our question arises, as it does with fundamental legal notions, because we are puzzled about the general category to which something belongs and how some general type of expression relates to fact, and not merely about the place within that category, then until the puzzle is cleared up, this form of definition is at best and illuminating, at the worst, profoundly misleading. That may not make much sense because it's part of another part, a bit larger paragraph. Okay, but I'll jump to this. Okay, so where he talks about a right, and oh, it's so sad. You know, Jeremy Bentham, I feel he's not given his due. He's not given due credit. And I've always thought this, and I'm so proud that Hart holds him in such high esteem and respects his ideas and builds on them. Because I think perhaps his style was very dense, and he's with the hedonistic calculus, he's basically trying to make a quantitative way of measuring, building on his idea, his utilitarianism, expounding it into ideas in an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, trying to basically quantify weightings of pain and pleasure as they relate to the law. So maybe he went too far, and everyone says, "Oh, you can't quantify these things. There's so many factors that go into it." And Hart agrees, but what an effort! What an effort! And I don't think he's given enough credit, and I'm glad Hart does that. And I mentioned this because just before the part I'm about to read, he says of this method that Bentham practiced it but didn't preach it. In other words, he was doing it inadvertently. He was explaining things this way. Yeah, actually, this is an example. Perfect. Yeah, in fact, I'll read this. So he says, for instance, but more often, he is speaking of Bentham, but more often, and much to our profit, he, Bentham, does not claim to paraphrase, but he makes a different kind of remark in order to elucidate these words, remarks such as these. What you have a right to, well, so now here he's trying to explain how Hart would explain what it means to have a right, or what is a right. Yeah, sorry, I must be precise here. What is a right? So he says, quoting Bentham here, what you have a right to. Wait, what? What you have a right to have me okay. Why was Bentham like this? Anyways, what you have a right to have me made to is that which I am liable, according to law, upon a requisition made on your behalf to be punished for not doing. You see, he's not paraphrasing as such, but he's explaining in other words, or he's giving conditions in which this would hold. Or, quote, to know how to expound a right, carry your eye to the act which, in the circumstances in question, would be a violation of that right. The law creates the right by forbidding the act. End quote. These, though defective, are on many rights, are on the right lines. They are not paraphrases, but they specify some of the conditions necessary for the truth of a sentence of the form, you have a right. Bentham shows us how these conditions include the existence of a law imposing a duty on some other person, and moreover, that it must be a law which provides that the breach of the duty shall be visited with a sanction if you or someone on your behalf so choose. This has many virtues. By refusing to identify the meaning of the word right with psychological or physical fact, it correctly leaves open the question whether on any given occasion the person who has a right in fact in expectation of power, and so it leaves us free to treat men's expectations of powers as what in general men will have if there is a system of rights, and as part of what a system of rights is generally intended to secure. Brilliant. Okay, so he says it's defective, but it works. Now, he goes on to give his own version. So he says, quote, this is page 35, quote, for it is, I think, characteristic of those laws that confer, you know what, calm down, okay. For it is, I think, characteristic of those laws that confer rights, as distinguished from those that only impose obligations, that the obligation to perform the corresponding duty is made by law to depend on the choice of the individual who is said to have the right, or the choice of some person authorized to act on his behalf. So here it goes on to, this is the main part. Quote, I would therefore tender the following as an elucidation of the expression, a legal right. 1. A statement of the form, X has a right is true if the following conditions are satisfied. A. There is in existence a legal system. B. Under a rule or rules of the system, Some other person, Y, is, in the events which have happened, obliged to do or abstain from some action. C, this obligation is made by law dependent on the choice either of X or some other person authorized to act on his behalf, so that either Y is bound to do or abstain from some action only if X or some authorized person so chooses, alternatively, only until X or such person chooses otherwise. 2. The statement of the form X has a right is used to draw a conclusion of law in a particular case which falls under such rules. So he's basically explaining the expression a legal right without giving us synonyms for the word right or using a dictionary meaning for it, but giving us statements which, if true, would constitute a definition for that. And he gives the example of a trick in a game where if you did it, if someone asked you what a trick meant in a game of cards and you did explain it to them by saying, well, if you picked 4 cards and that happened, and that would be a trick, you have explained what a trick is without defining trick. And that's the method he's trying to introduce here. Okay, so I'll end here with that first chapter, because that's a highlight for me, that part. This may be a bit all over for okay. What I mean is it may be yeah, here now. So if one is okay, so let's go on with okay, so now I'll start reading the second essay. That's essay 2. I did start earlier, but I think I'll just do it again. I'll start I'll go again from the beginning. Okay, so essay 2, positivism and the separation of laws and morals. Just a sec, mama. Okay. Positivism and the separation of law and morals. In this article, I shall discuss and attempt to defend a view which Mr. Justice Holmes, among others, held, and for which he and they have been much criticized. But I wish first to say why I think that Holmes, whatever the vicissitudes of his American reputation may be, will always remain for Englishmen a heroic figure in jurisprudence. You know what? I read this, so I think I'll skip. Sorry, I'll skip it. I'm just keen to see what he says after all this. Okay, yeah, I think I'll start here. Okay, there's a massive Austin quote here. I think I'll do that again. Okay, so Bentham, in fact, this is what I was referring to earlier, where he says of how what they were doing did have meaning in real life and on society and on the legal system. Okay, so Bentham and Austin were not dry analysts fiddling with verbal distinctions while cities burned, but they were the vanguard of a movement which labored with passionate intensity and much success to bring about a better society and better laws. How true. Why then did they insist on the separation of law as it is and law as it ought to be? What did they mean? Let us first see what they said. Austin formulated the doctrine. Now, this is a quote from Austin. Quote, the existence of law is one thing, its merit or demerit is another. Whether it be or not be is one inquiry, whether it be or not be comfortable to an assumed standard is a different inquiry. A law which actually exists is a law, though we happen to dislike it, although it varies from the text by which we regulate our approbation or disapprobation. This truth, when formally announced as an abstract proposition, is so simple and glaring that it seems idle to insist upon, but simple and glaring as it is, when enunciated in abstract expressions, the enumeration of the instances in which it has been forgotten would fill a volume. Sir William Blackstone, for example, says in his commentaries that the laws of God are superior in obligation to all other laws, that no human laws should be suffered to contradict them, that human laws are of no validity if they contradict them, that all valid laws derive their force from that divine origin. But he may mean that all human laws ought to conform to the divine laws. If this be his meaning, I assent to it without hesitation. Ooh, there goes the attack on naturalism. Perhaps again, that's why when Hart said he he was much inspired by the work by Finis, I guess he appreciated. Well, I did look into this because in the introduction it says he loved Finis's work, and I believe Finis defends natural law, but he also believes laws to derive. He also believes the positive claim. You know what? I may be wrong here, but my sense so far is he does believe the positivist claim that law and morality are distinct to be true, but he also believes in naturalism at the same time. So Hart respects Finis's respect for that distinction, but doesn't quite agree with him on naturalism. That's my sense because I was wondering, I did try to read Finis, and perhaps I didn't get to the part where he does this, but it sounded a lot like what Austin here is saying Sir William Blackstone would do. So yeah, anyways, going on. Now, he may meet, these guys are interesting. I love, and you know what? When I was reading the concept of law, I felt so sorry for Austin. Because Hart, oh my God. Can you imagine being in a debate with Hart? This guy, his rebuttals are strong. So when I was reading, how he was just, and he starts by laying out the argument to show, I really get what you're saying. And then he very masterly dismantles it. So now reading Austin doing the same to Blackstone, I'm like, okay, maybe it's good riddance, or at least it's just how the game goes. Well, and I'm so glad as well that Hart lived to be able to respond to many of his critics. He responds to Fuller, he responds to Finis, he responds to Dworkin, he responds to so many people. Rawls, all in these essays over 28 years. And just before there's an interview online, just before he publishes Law, Liberty, and Morality, in which he's responding to other people that had commented on earlier books. So I'm always happy when that happens. Because I was reading some of these other people's theories before, and I was thinking, wait, Dworkin, you don't quite capture what he says, right? But I was thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I didn't get what Hart was saying. And I felt such vindication reading introductions to some of his responses that seemed to suggest the same. So I'm like, oh, I'm glad you did get a chance to speak for yourself, Which makes me feel sad about people like Pessoa, who, he leaves all his work written in a house, and oh my gosh, endless volumes. Of course, we're happy to have them, but we won't have the benefit, at least in this life. Because I do believe we'll meet these people in heaven, at least many of them that believe the gospel, or many of them that will be in heaven, and we'll have a chance to have these conversations. Now, those are my wild imaginations. But, Pessoa speaks of how, people speak of how Pessoa leaves all these volumes, and we'll never get the benefit of, in this life, hearing him explain what he meant. Anyways, I'm going off track here. But, okay. Now, he may mean that all human laws I'm still reading Austin's response to, oh my God, to William Blackstone. Now, he may mean that all human laws ought to conform to the divine laws. If this be his meaning, I assent to it without hesitation. Perhaps again, he means that human lawgivers are themselves obliged by the divine laws to fashion the laws which they impose by the ultimate standard, because if they do not, God will punish them. To this also I entirely assent. But the meaning of this passage of Blackstone, if it has a, oh my God, if it has a meaning, seems rather to be this, that no human law which, oh my God, that no human law which conflicts with the divine law is obligatory or binding. In other words, that no human law which conflicts with the divine law is a law. Yeah, that's what he seems to be saying. But how could he even think that? I feel like naturalists, I'm speaking broadly here, but I think to make this kind of argument, one must, I don't know, there must be a break in, okay, you know what? So, Hart goes on now. Austin's protest against blurring the distinction between what law is and what it ought to be is quite general. You see? It is a mistake, however, whatever our standard of what ought to be, whatever the text by which we regulate our approbation or disapprobation. His examples, however, are always a confusion between law as it is and law as morality would require it to be. For him, it must be remembered the fundamental principles of morality were God's commands, to which utility was an index. Besides this, there was the actual accepted morality of a social group or positive morality. Bentham insisted on this distinction without characterizing morality by reference to God, but only, of course, by reference to the principles of utility. Both thinkers' prime reason for this insistence was to enable men to see steadily the precise issues posed by the existence of morally bad laws and to understand the specific character of the authority of a legal order. Bentham's general recipe for life under the government of laws was simple. It was, quote, to obey punctually, to censure freely. But Bentham was especially aware, as an anxious spectator of the French Revolution, that this was not enough. The time might come in any society when the law's commands were so evil that the question of resistance had to be faced, and it was then essential that the issues at stake at this point should neither be oversimplified nor obscured. This was precisely what the confusion between law and morals had done, and Bentham found that the confusion had spread symmetrically in two different directions. On one hand, Bentham had in mind the anarchist who argues thus: this ought to be the law, therefore it is not. I am free not merely to censure, but to disregard it. On the other hand, he thought of the reactionary who argues, this is the law, therefore it is what it ought to be. And thus stifles criticism and its birth. Both errors, Bentham thought, were to be found in Blackstone. There was his incautious statement that human laws were invalid if contrary to the law of God, and, quote, that spirit of obsequious quietism that seems constitutional in our author, which, quote, will scarce ever let him recognize a difference between what is and what ought to be. This indeed was for Bentham the occupational disease of lawyers. Quote, in the eyes of lawyers, not to speak of their dupes, oh my, that is to say as yet, the generality of non-lawyers, the is and the ought to be were one and indivisible. There and therefore two dangers between, he actually says that, so I'm not reading this wrong. There are therefore two dangers, so I was wrong. There are therefore two dangers between which insistence on this distinction will help us to steer. The danger that law and its authority may be dissolved in man's conceptions of what law ought to be, and the danger that the existing law may supplant morality as the final test of conduct, and so escape criticism. I'll make this, it won't. Okay. In view of later criticisms, it's also important to distinguish several things the utilitarians did not mean by insisting on their separation of law and morals. They certainly accepted many of the things that might be called, quote, the intersection of law and morals. First, they never denied that, as a matter of historical fact, the deployment of legal systems has been powerfully influenced by moral opinion, and conversely, that moral standards had been profoundly influenced by law, exactly, so that the content of many legal systems mirrored moral rules or principles. It's not, in fact, always easy to trace this historical causal connection, but Bentham was certainly ready to admit its existence. So too Austin spoke of the, quote, frequent coincidence of positive law and morality, and attributed the confusion of what law is with what law ought to be to this very fact. Secondly, neither Bentham nor his followers denied that by explicit legal provisions, moral principles might at different points be brought into a legal system and form part of its rules. Bentham nor his followers denied that by explicit legal provisions, moral principles, that's right. For instance, those giving judges the power to use their discretion where a case is on the fringes of what the law says. So to make, I believe that's what they say anyways. Secondly, neither Bentham nor his followers denied that by explicit legal provisions, moral principles might at different points be brought into a legal system and form part of its rules, or that courts exactly might be legally bound to decide in accordance with what they thought just or best. Bentham indeed recognized, as Austin did not, that even the supreme legislative power might be subjected to legal constraints by constitution, and would not have denied that moral principles, like those of the Fifth Amendment, that's of the US Constitution, might form the content of such legal constitutional restraints. Austin differed in thinking. Come on, what's this? Austin differed in thinking that restraints on the supreme legislative power could not have the force of law, but would remain merely political or moral checks. But of course, he would have recognized that a statute, for example, might confer delegated legislative power and restrict the area of its exercise by reference to moral principles. What both Bentham and Austin were anxious to assert were the following two simple things. Ooh, here comes the clarity. First, in the absence of an expressed constitutional or legal provision, it could not follow from the mere fact that a rule violated standards of morality that it was not a rule of law, and conversely, that it could not follow from the mere fact that a rule was morally desirable that it was a rule of law. I need to highlight this. But it will take me ages. I should have thought of this. I'll actually open this because my tablet's dead. Goodness. I'll find it here. This page. Where's my... It's actually powerful. 55. I need just a second. It's right there. Okay. All right. Cool. Huh. Yep, that's exactly right. Okay. Sorry if anyone's watching this. Yeah. Both were anxious to assert for the following two. It's actually very powerful. The history of this simple doctrine in the 19th century is too long and too intricate to trace here. Let me summarize it by saying that after it was propounded to the world by Austin, it dominated English jurisprudence and constitutes part of the framework of most of the curiously English and perhaps unsatisfactory products. The omnibus surveys of, I actually was reading this word in, you know what, never mind. The omnibus surveys of the whole field of jurisprudence. A succession of these were published after a full text of Austin's lectures finally appeared in 1863. Wow. In each of them, can you imagine people think of 2024 this way? In each of them, the utilitarian separation, but not then. We're living in the now, so it's they felt the same now. Well, they felt the same as we do feel now. They probably felt the same now as do in some respects. In some respects. In each of them, the utilitarian separation of law and morals is treated as something that enables lawyers to attain a new clarity. Austin was said by one of his English successors, Amos, quote, to have delivered the law from the dead body of morality. Ooh, that still clung to it. Who is Amos? In the Science of Law, 5th edition. Interesting. 1896. Okay. And even Maine, who was critical of Austin at many points, did not question this part of his doctrine. United States men like Anne St. John Green, Gray, and Holmes considered the insistence, this distinction that enabled the understanding of law as a means of social control to get off a fruitful new start. They welcomed it both as self-evident and as illuminating, as a revealing tautology. This distinction is, of course, one of the main themes of Holmes' most famous essay, The Path of the Law. But the place it had in the estimation of these American writers is best seen in what Gray wrote at the turn of the century in The Nature of the Source of the Law. He said, quote, the great gain in its fundamental conceptions with jurisprudence made during the last century was the recognition of the truth that the law of a state is not an ideal, but something which actually exists. It is not which ought to be, but that which is. To fix this definitely, I thought he would say definitively, but fix this definitely in the jurisprudence of the common law is the feat that Austin accomplished. Okay. Wow. This is Holmes. Okay. Now moving on. 2. So much for the doctrine in the heyday of its success. Let us turn now to some of the criticisms. Undoubtedly, when Bentham and Austin insisted on the distinction between law as it is and as it ought to be, they had in mind particular laws, the meanings of which were clear and so not in dispute, and they were concerned to argue that such laws, even if morally outrageous, were still laws. It is, however, necessary, in considering the criticisms which later developed, to consider more than those criticisms which were directed at this particular point, if we are to get at the root of the dissatisfaction felt. We must also take account of the objection that, even if what the utilitarians said on this particular point were true, their insistence on it, in a terminology suggesting a general cleavage between what is and what ought to be law, obscured the fact that at other points there is an essential point of contact between the two. From what follows, I consider not only the criticisms of the particular point which the utilitarians had in mind, but also the claim that an essential connection between law and morals emerges if we examine how laws, meanings of which are in dispute, are interpreted and applied in concrete cases, and that this connection emerges again if we widen our point of view and ask not whether every particular rule of law must satisfy a moral minimum in order to be law, but whether the system of law, okay, I get you, rules which altogether fail to do, okay. Next paragraph. There is, however, one major initial complexity by which criticism has been much confused. We must remember that the utilitarians combined with their insistence on the separation of law and morals two other equally famous but distinct doctrines. One was the important truth that a purely analytical study of legal principles, legal concepts, a study of the meaning of the distinctive vocabulary of law, was as vital to understanding of the nature of law as historical or sociological studies, though of course it could not supplant them. Yeah. The other doctrine was the famous interpretive theory of law, that law is essentially a command. Okay, he's about to start debunking that then. Okay, two main other arguments by the utilitarians. First is that it's rooted in beyond just purely analytical, traditional positivism would say. It takes into account historical, sociological facts. It doesn't supplant them. And law is essentially a command. Okay. So context and command. Okay. These three doctrines constitute the utilitarian tradition in jurisprudence. Yet they are distinct doctrines. It is possible to endorse the separation between law and morals and to value analytical inquiries into the meaning of legal concepts, and yet think it wrong to conceive of law as essentially a command. Yeah. One source of great confusion in the criticism of the separation of law and morals was the belief that the falsity of any one of these three doctrines in the utilitarian tradition showed the other two to be false. What was worse was the failure to see that there were three quite separate doctrines in this tradition. The indiscriminate use of the label positivism to describe ambiguously each one of these three separate doctrines together, as with some others which the utilitarians never professed, has perhaps confused the issue more than any other single factor. Okay. Some of the early American critics of the Austrian doctrine were, however, admirably clear on just this matter. Gray, for example, added at the end of the tribute to Austin, which I have already quoted the words, quote, "He may have been wrong in treating the law of the state as being the command of the sovereign." Wow. Close quote. Wow. Thank you. And he touched shrewdly on many points where the command theory is defective. But other critics see also had a legacy to build on. Thanks. But other critics have been much clear-headed and have thought that the inadequacies of the command theory, which gradually came to light, were sufficient to demonstrate the falsity of the separation of law and morals. This was a mistake, but a natural one. Oh God. Oh, why would they think that? It's not even a natural one. Okay, it's a mistake, but a natural one. See how natural it was. We must look a little more closely at the command idea. The famous theory that law is a command was a part of a wider and more ambitious claim. Austin said that the notion of a command was, quote, the key to the sciences of jurisprudence and morals, close quote, and contemporary attempts to elucidate moral judgments in terms of imperative or prescriptive utterances echo this ambitious claim. But the command theory, viewed as an effort to identify even the quintessence of law, let alone the quintessence of morals, seems breathtaking in its simplicity and quite inadequate. There is much, even in the simplest legal system, that is distorted if presented as a command. That's true. Yet the utilitarians thought that the essence of a legal system could be conveyed in the notion of a command, or supplemented by that of a habit of obedience. The simple scheme was this. What is a command? It is simply an expression by one person of the desire that another person should do or abstain from some action accompanied by the threat of punishment, which is likely to follow disobedience. See, he takes on his method even in explaining this and to highlight that as well. Commands are laws if two conditions are satisfied. First, they must be general. Second, they must be commanded by what, as both Bentham and Austin claimed, exists in every political society, whatever its constitutional form, namely a person or a group of persons who are in receipt of habitual obedience from most of the society, but pay no such obedience to others. Some sovereign. I don't know if it says sovereign. It's okay. These persons are its sovereign. Thus, law is the command of. Oh, he's going from the beginning. He's not skipping any steps. These persons are its sovereign. Thus, law is the command of the uncommanded commanders. Thus, law is the command of the uncommanded commanders of society, the creation of a legally untrammeled will of the sovereign, who is by definition outside the law. See how Hart now goes into the rule of recognition. It is easy to see that this account of a legal system is threadbare. One can also see why it might seem that its inadequacy is due to the omission of some essential connection with morality. The situation with the simple trilogy of command, sanction, and sovereign avails to describe, if you take these notions at all precisely, is like that of a gunman saying to his victim, "Give me your money or your life." The only difference is that in the case of a legal system, the gunman says to a large number of people who are accustomed to the racket and habitual surrender to it. Law surely is not the gunman, situation writ large, and legal order is surely not to be thus simply identified with compulsion. She's now getting at what he says in the concept of law. This scheme, despite the points of obvious analogy between a statute and a command, omits some of the most characteristic elements of law. Let me cite a few. It's wrong to think of a legislature and a fortiori an electorate with a changing membership as a group of persons habitually obeyed. This simple idea is suited only to a monarch sufficiently long-lived for the habit to grow up. Even if we waive this point, nothing which legislators do makes law unless they comply with fundamental accepted rules specifying the essential law-making procedures. This is true even in a system having a simple unitary constitution like the British. The fundamental accepted rules specifying that the legislature must do to legislate what the legislature must do to legislate are not commands habitually obeyed, nor can they be expressed as habits of obedience to persons. They lie at the root of a legal system, and what is most missing in the utilitarian scheme is an analysis of what it is for a social group and its officials to accept such rules. This notion, not that of a command as Austin claimed, is the key to the science of jurisprudence, or at least one of the keys. Again, Austin, in the case of overambitious, as Bernard Williams was said to be in this book right behind me, Truth and Truthfulness, in a review I read by, I forgot the guy's name. Okay. Again, Austin, in the case of a democracy, looked past the legislators to the electorate as the sovereign, or in England as part of it. He thought that in the United States, the mass of the electors to the state and the federal legislatures were the sovereign, whose commands, given by their agents in the legislatures, were law. But on this footing, the whole notion of the sovereign outside the law being habitually obeyed by the bulk of the population must go. For in the case the bulks obeys the bulk, that is, it obeys itself. Plainly, the general acceptance of the authority of a law-making procedure, irrespective, it's not a big point there. Can only be destroyed by the answer in terms of mass habitual obedience to certain persons, who are by definition outside the law, as the cognate but much simpler phenomenon of the general social acceptance of a rule. See if taking over half from Henry Church will be distorted if represented as habitual obedience. Okay, yeah, that's right. Other critics dimly sensed a further and more important defect in the command theory, yet blurred the edge on unimportant criticism by assuming that the defect was due to the failure to insist upon some important connection between law and morals. This more radical defect is as follows. The picture that command theory draws of life under law is essentially a simple relationship of the commander to the commanded, of superior to inferior, of bottom to top. The relationship is vertical between the commanders or authors of the law conceived of as essentially outside the law and those who are commanded and subject to the law. In this picture, no place, or only an accidental or subordinate place, is afforded for distinction between types of legal rules which are in fact radically different. Some laws require men to act in certain ways or to abstain from acting whether they wish to or not. The criminal law largely consists of rules of this sort. Like commands, they are simply obeyed or disobeyed. But other rules are presented to society in quite different ways and have quite different functions. They provide facilities, more or less elaborate, for individuals to create structures of rights and duties for the conduct of life within the coercive framework of the law. Such are the rules enabling individuals to make contracts, wills, and trusts, and generally to mold. Now he's now getting into secondary rules, trusts, because those are not commands, generally to mold their legal relations with others. Such rules, unlike the criminal law, are not factors designed to obstruct wishes. To highlight this as well. Are not designed to obstruct. Okay, I'll read that again. Such are the rules enabling individuals to make contracts. I think I'll go back. This is so good. In fact, I'll just go back all the way because, bro, this is amazing. Let's start this one. Okay, I'll just take the whole paragraph again. Other critics dimly sensed a further and more important defect in the command theory, yet blurred the edge of unimportant criticism by assuming that the defect was due to the failure to insist upon some important connection between law and morals. This more radical defect is as follows. The picture that the command theory draws of life under law is essentially a simple relationship of the commander to the commanded, of superior to inferior, of top to bottom. The relationship is vertical between the commanders or authors of the law, conceived of as essentially outside the law, and those who are commanded and subject to the law. In this picture, no place, or only an accidental subordinate place is afforded for a distinction between types of legal rules which are in fact radically different. Some laws require men to act in certain ways or to abstain from acting whether they wish to or not. The criminal law consists largely of rules of this sort. Like commands, they are simply obeyed or disobeyed, but other legal rules are presented to society in quite different ways and have quite different functions. They provide facilities more or less elaborate for individuals to create structures of rights and duties for the conduct of life within the coercive framework of the law, such as the rules enabling individuals to make contracts, wills, and trusts, and generally to mold their legal relations with others. Such rules, unlike the criminal law, are not factors designed to obstruct wishes and choices of an antisocial sort. On the contrary, these rules provide facilities for the realization of wishes and choices. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Wishes and choices. They do not say, like commands, do this whether you wish to or not, whether you wish it or not, but rather, if you wish to do this, here is the way to do it. Under these rules, we exercise powers, make claims, and assert rights. These phrases mark off characteristic features of laws that confer rights and powers, and laws which are, so to speak, put at the disposition of individuals, in a way in which the criminal law is not. Such ingenuity has gone into the task of reducing of this second sort to some complex variant of laws of the first sort. Or even, I think there was a lack of recognition of them in the first place, so I don't think it was active reduction, unless they were recognized in Bentham or Hart's works that he's referring to that I don't know of. Anyways, the effort to show that laws conferring rights are really only conditional stipulations of sanctions to be exacted from the person, ultimately under legal duty, references much of Kelson's work. Yet to argue this is really just to exhibit dogmatic determination to suppress one aspect of the legal system in order to maintain theory. The stipulation of a sanction, like Austin's command, represents the quintessence of law. One might as well urge that the rules of baseball were really only complex conditional directions to the scorer, and that these showed their real or essential nature. One of the first jurists in England to break with this Austinian tradition, Salmon, complained that the analysis in terms of commands left the notion of a right unprovided with a place. He confused the point. He argued first, and correctly, that if laws are merely commands, it is inexplicable that we should have to come to speak of legal rights and powers as conferred or rising under them, but then wrongly concluded that the rules of a legal system must necessarily be connected with more rules or principles of justice, that only on this footing could the phenomenon of legal rights be explained. Otherwise, someone thought would have to say that a mere verbal coincidence connects the concepts of legal and moral right. Similarly, continental critics of the utilitarians, always alive to the complexity of the notion of a subjective right, insisted that the command theory gave it no place. Hagerstrom insisted that if laws were merely commands, the notion of an individual's rights was really inexplicable, for commands are, as he said, something which we either obeyed or we do not obey. They do not confer rights. Excuse me. But he too concluded that moral, or as he put it, common sense notions of justice must therefore be necessarily involved in the analysis of any legal structure elaborate enough to confer rights. Yet, surely these arguments are confused. Rules that confer rights, though distinct from commands, need not be moral rules or coincidence with them. Rights, after all, exist under the rules of ceremonies, games, and many other spheres regulated by rules which are relevant to the question of justice, what the law ought to be. Nor need rules which confer rights be just or morally good rules. The right of a master over his slaves show us that. The merit or demerit, as Hart termed it, depends on how rights are distributed in society and over whom or what they are exercised. These critics indeed reveal the inadequacy of the simple notions of command and habit for the analysis of law. At many points, it is apparent that the social acceptance of a rule or standard of authority, even if it is motivated only by fear or superstition or rests on inertia, must be brought into the analysis and cannot itself be reduced to two simple terms. Yet nothing in this short the utilitarian insistence on the distinction between the existence of law and its merits to be wrong. This is brilliant. Ooh, this is so good. Let me highlight that. I like how he quotes Austin in saying the merits or demerits. Okay. Three. I now turn to a distinctly American criticism of the separation of the law that is from the law that ought to be. It emerged from the critical study of the judicial process with which American jurisprudence has been on the whole so beneficially occupied. The most skeptical of these critics, the loosely named realists of the 1930s, perhaps too naively accepted the conceptual framework of the natural sciences as adequate for the characterization of law, for the analysis of rule-guided action, of which a living system of law at least partly consists. But they opened men's eyes to what actually goes on when courts decide cases. So that's why Bentham was also useful. And the contrast they drew between the actual facts of judicial decision and the traditional terminology for describing it, as if it were a wholly logical operation, was usually illuminating, for in spite of some exaggeration, the realists made us acutely conscious of one cardinal feature of human language and human thought, emphasis on which is vital, if only for the understanding of law, but in areas of philosophy far beyond the confines of jurisprudence. The insight of this school may be presented in the following example. A legal rule forbids you to take a vehicle into a public park. Plainly, this forbids an automobile. But what about bicycles, roller skates? Oh, he's going into the purpose of the rule. And how that this can't be. Okay. Does it really violate the reason for which the rule was made? I see where you're going. Okay. Let me just take this again. The insight of this school may be presented in the following example. A legal rule forbids you to take a vehicle into the public park. Plainly, this forbids an automobile. But what about bicycles, roller skates, toy automobiles? What about aeroplanes? Are these, as we say, to be called vehicles for the purpose of the rule or not? If we are to communicate with each other at all, and if, as in the most elementary form of law, we have to express our intentions that a certain type of behavior be regulated by rules, and the general words we use, like vehicle in the case I consider, must have some standard insistence, must have some standard instance in which no doubts are felt about its application. There must be a core of settling meaning. There will be, as well, a penumbra of debatable cases in which words are neither obviously applied nor obviously ruled out. These cases, which will each have some features in common, with the standard case, they will lack others or be accompanied by features not present in the standard case. Human intervention and natural processes continually throw up such variants on the familiar. If we are to say that the ranges of facts do or do not fall under existing rules, then the classifier must make a decision which is not dictated to him, for the facts and phenomena to which we fit our words and apply our rules are, as it were, dumb. The toy automobile cannot speak up and say, I'm a vehicle for the purpose of this legal rule. Look on the roller skates chorus. We're not a vehicle. Fact situations do not await us neatly labeled, creased, and folded, nor is there classification written on them, which we simply read off by the judge. Instead, in applying legal rules, someone must take the responsibility of deciding that words do or do not cover some case in mind, with all the practical consequences involved in this decision. We may call the problems which arise outside the hard core of standard instances or settled meanings problems of the penumbra. Like that. This is so good. They're always with us, whether in relation to such trivial things as the regulation of the use of the public park, in relation to the multidimensional generalities of a constitution. If a penumbra of uncertainty must surround all legal rules, then their application to specific cases in the penumbral area cannot be a matter of logical deduction, and so deductive reasoning, which for generations has been cherished as the very perfection of human reasoning, cannot serve as a model for judges or indeed anyone. Heart is the perfect balance between logic and empathy. If the penumbra of uncertainty must surround all legal rules, then the application to specific cases in the penumbral area cannot be a matter of legal deduction. So deductive reasoning, which for generations has been cherished as the very perfection of human reasoning, and in Truth and Truthfulness, by the way, Bernard Williams goes against the push against this very notion. I think Hart would agree because, you know what, let's focus here. Cannot serve as a model for what judges, or indeed anyone, should do in bringing particular cases under general rules. In this area, men cannot live by deduction alone, as it follows that if legal arguments and legal decisions of penumbral questions are to be rational, their rationality must lie in something other than a logical relation to premises. So if it is rational or sound to argue and to decide that for the purposes of this rule, or aeroplane is not a vehicle, this argument must be sound or rational without being logically conclusive. What is it then that makes such decisions correct, or at least better than alternative decisions? Again, it seems true to say that the criterion which makes a decision sound in such cases is some concept of what the law ought to be. It is easy to slide from that into saying that it must be a moral judgment about what law ought to be. So here we touch upon a point of necessary intersection between laws and morals, which demonstrates the falsity, or at any rate the misleading character of the utilitarians' emphatic insistence on the separation of law as it is and ought to be. Surely, Bentham and Austin could only have written as they did because they misunderstood and neglected this aspect of the judicial process, because they ignored the problems of the penumbra. R&B. Sorry. Oh dear. They still give us a lot. Okay. The misconception of the judicial process, which I wonder what Austin would think of Hart. The misconception of the judicial process, which ignores problems of the penumbra, and which views the process as, I wish he could give us rebuttal, but I feel like he wouldn't have much because Hart clearly builds on it. Yeah. Misconception of I think he would cede to his points. And they would probably work together. Misconception of the judicial process, which ignores the problems of the penumbra, and which views the process as consisting preeminently in deductive reasoning, is often stigmatized as the error of formalism or literalism. My question now is, how and to what extent does the demonstration of this error show the utilitarian distinction to be wrong or misleading? There are many issues which have been confused, but I can only disentangle some. The charge of formalism has been leveled both at the positivist legal theorist and at the courts, but of course it must be a very different charge in each case. Leveled at the legal theorist, the charge means that he has made a theoretical mistake about the character of legal decision, he has thought of the reasoning involved as consisting in deduction from premises in which the judge's practical choices or decisions play no part. It would be easy to show that Austin was guiltless of this error. Only an entire misconception of what analytical jurisprudence is and why he thought it important was led to the view that he, when the analyst, believed that the law was a closed logical system in which judges deduce their decisions from premises. On the contrary, he was very much alive to the character of language, whose vagueness or open character. He thought that in the penumbral situation, judges must necessarily legislate, and in absence, I sometimes recall those of the late Judge Jerome Frank, he berated the common law judges for legislating feebly and timidly and for blindly relying on the real or fancied analogies with past cases instead of adapting their decisions to the growing needs of society as revealed by the moral standard of utility. The villains of this piece, responsible for the conception of the judge as an automation, are not the utilitarian thinkers. The responsibility is to be laid at the door of any theorist. Oh my God. I like this. Okay. How do you even think to add that phrase? Is with thinkers like, oh dear, like Blackstone and, at an earlier stage, Montesquieu. Montesquieu sounds like a French name. The root of this evil is preoccupation with the separation of powers and Blackstone's, quote, childish fiction. Oh dear, I've had deja vu of this. I've literally had, this has happened before. It's now gone, but that moment happened before. The root of this evil is preoccupied with the separation of powers. Blackstone's childish, quote, childish fiction. It didn't come back, but a sense of it did. The root of this evil is preoccupation with the separation of powers and Blackstone's, quote, childish fiction. Again, a sense of it, not the real thing, but a sense of it still, but discernible from an absence of anything in relation to that. So it is still something. It seems it comes back each time I read. Maybe it will come back this time again. Let me try again. The root of this evil is preoccupation with the separation of powers. It came back again. Childish fiction. I was termed it. The judges only find, never make a law. Formalist. Now I would have understood Scalia easier. But we are concerned with formalism as a vice not of jurists, but of judges. What precisely is it for a judge to commit this error? To be a formalist, automatic, a slot machine. Curiously enough, the literature, which is full of the denunciation of these vices, never makes this clear in concrete terms. He said we have only descriptions which cannot mean what they appear to say. It is said that in the formalist era, courts make an excessive use of logic, take a thing to quote a dryly logical extreme, make an excessive use of analytical methods. Just how, in being a formalist, does a judge make an excessive use of logic? It is clear that the essence of his error is to give some general term and interpretation which is blind to social values and consequences, which is in some other way stupid or perhaps merely disliked by critics. But logic does not prescribe interpretation of terms, dictates neither the stupid nor intelligent interpretation of any expression. Logic only tells you hypothetically that if you give a certain term a certain interpretation, then a certain conclusion follows. Logic is silent on how to classify particulars. This is the heart of a judicial. Oh dear. I wonder what. Well, I think you'd agree. I was thinking what Russell would think here. He's a brilliant logician. I likely wrote about this. This man. give us the analogy of the 37. Oh, so far ahead. Okay. Logic is silent on how to classify particulars. This is the heart of a judicial decision. Logic is silent on how to classify particulars. This is the heart of a judicial decision. So this reference to logic, to logical extremes, is a misnomer for something else, which must be this. A judge has to apply a rule to a concrete case, perhaps the rule that one may not take a stolen vehicle across state lines, and in this case, an aeroplane has been taken. He either does not see or pretends not to see that the general terms of this rule are susceptible to different forms, to different interpretations, and that he has a choice left open and controlled by linguistic conventions. He ignores or is blind to the fact that he is in the area of the penumbra. He's going to deal with a standard case. Instead of choosing in the light of social aims, he just fixes the meaning in a different way. He takes the meaning that the word most obviously suggests its ordinary non-legal context to ordinary man, or one which the word has been given in some other logical legal context, or still worse, he thinks of it in, for example, in the case of a vehicle, 1, normally used on land, 2, capable of carrying a human person, 3, capable of, wow. It doesn't, oh my God, this man, it doesn't even, he lets you do with it what you will, and yet it makes sense. You should trust others to make sense of things that they should be familiar with. It's a good lesson here. Keep being self-propelled and treat these three as always necessary and always sufficient conditions for the use in all contexts of the word vehicle, irrespective of the social consequences of giving it this interpretation. This choice, not logic, would force the judge to include a toy motor car, if electrically propelled, to exclude bicycles, the aeroplane. In all this, there is possibly great stupidity, no more logic and no less, than in cases in which interpretation given to a general term and the consequent application of the general rule, some particular cases unconsciously controlled by some identified social aim. Decisions made in a fashion as blind as this would scarcely deserve the name of decisions, but as well pass a penny in applying a rule of law. Oh God. But it is at least doubtful whether any judicial decision, even in England, have been quite as automatic as this, rather, especially the interpretation of stigmatized and as automatic rather either the interpretations stigmatized as automatic have resulted from the conviction that it is fair in a criminal statute to take a meaning which would jump to the mind of the ordinary man at the cost even of defeating other values, and this itself is a social policy, or possibly a bad one, or much more frequently, what is stigmatized as mechanical and automatic is a determined choice made indeed in the light of a social aim, of a conservative social aim. Oh, this man, look at how fine a distinction he makes there. I'm sure he's going to tell us why he believes that to be the case. Certainly, many of the Supreme Court decisions at the turn of the century, which have been so stigmatized, represent clear choices in the penumbral area to give effect to a policy of a conservative type. See? This is peculiarly true of Mr. Justice Peckham's opinions defining the spheres of police power and due process. How does the wrongness of deciding cases in an automatic, mechanical way, and the rightness of deciding cases by reference to social purposes, show that the utilitarian insistence on the distinction between what the law is, and what it ought to be, is wrong? I take it that no one who wished to use these vices of formalism as proof The distinction between what is and what ought to be is mistaken, would deny that the decisions stigmatized as automatic are law, nor would he deny that the system in which such automatic decisions are made is a legal system. He would certainly say they are law, but they are bad law. They ought not to be law. This would be to use the distinction, not to refute it. And of course, both Bentham and Austin used it to attack judges for failing to decide penumbra cases in accordance with the growing needs of society. Let's see, I need to stop here. Okay, I'll stop here. Society. This is page 68. Wow. All right. Thank you. This was fun.